Okay, if you would, on your Bible tonight to 1 Corinthians 12. 1 Corinthians 12 here on Wednesday night. We've been studying the gifts of the Spirit. We'll continue on with that subject tonight. In 1 Corinthians 12, it says in verse 7, "But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. For to one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge by the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another the gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another divers kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues." Tonight we're going to look at tongues, the gift of tongues. It says that the Spirit of God gives to another divers kinds or kinds of tongues. Now, Paul devotes 3 chapters right here in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 to define the true gifts of the Spirit so no one would be deceived by them. There's a lot of false gifts that men have today. They're counterfeits. And 1 Corinthians chapter 14, that whole chapter is devoted completely to the gift of tongues. The whole chapter. And it's the only gift that I can think of where a whole chapter of the Bible is devoted to it. And yet it's way down on the list, and yet Paul devotes a whole chapter to that subject of speaking in tongues. And evidently God inspired Paul to spend a whole chapter writing about that gift because God foreknew how that gift would be the easiest to counterfeit. And we're seeing that today. Today we see the devil's counterfeit signs and wonders today. God foreknew that would take place. And so he inspired the Apostle Paul to tell us all we need to know about tongues, the gift of tongues. Now we'll first talk about the definition of tongues. Turn your Bible, Acts chapter 2, the definition. You know, there's a law of Bible study that is called the law of first mention. The law of first mention. That means that the way that something appears for the first time in the Bible fixes its definition from that time forward. The first time it appears in the Bible usually fixes the definition of that subject from that time forward. Well, the first time in Bible history that men were given the gift of tongues was in Jerusalem in 33 A.D. And that event is recorded in Acts chapter 2. And what God says about the gift of tongues in Acts 2 fixes, it establishes the definition of tongues for the rest of the Bible. The gift of tongues in the Bible are the tongues of Acts 2. And if they're not the same as Acts 2, they're not the true gift of tongues. Now we read in verse 1, "And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven, as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues, like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Ghost," that's the apostles, "and began to speak with other tongues, as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men, out of every nation under heaven. Now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together, and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. And they were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born?" Now, according to verse 5 here, on the day of Pentecost, there was a great multitude, a great number of Jews and Gentile proselytes gathered together in Jerusalem out of every nation under heaven. And because there were many nations and nationalities present that day, there were also, of course, many different languages spoken. Well, in order for these men here, out of every nation under heaven, to believe the gospel, they had to hear it preached in their own language. Therefore, God gave the 12 apostles the gift of tongues. And according to verse 4, when they spoke in tongues, they spoke in the language of everybody present that day in Jerusalem. Look at verse 4. In verse 4 it says that they began to speak with other tongues. Then compare that with verse 6. Every man heard them speak in his own language. One verse says tongues, the other verse says language. That shows you this, that in the Bible, when men spoke in tongues, they spoke in languages that could be interpreted and understood. And that's why the words tongues and languages are used interchangeably in Acts chapter 2, verse 4, 5, and 6. I might also give you a couple of verses to write down and see how the word tongue and language are used interchangeably. And that's Deuteronomy 28:49 and Jeremiah 5:15. Jeremiah 5:15 compared with Deuteronomy 28:49. These two verses say the same thing, but one verse says tongues and the other verse says languages. They're used interchangeably. So make no mistake about it, when the apostles spoke in tongues, they did not speak in this mindless gibberish and this wacko babbling you hear today. They spoke in foreign languages that could be understood by men out of every nation under heaven. Every nationality present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost heard the gospel preached in their own language or tongue. Now let's talk about the opposition of tongues. Now there are many charismatics today who oppose this true definition of tongues to get around the fact that tongues are languages. When you point out, well, tongues are languages, language is a tongue in Acts 2, they will say, wait a minute, the tongues in 1 Corinthians 14 are different. You say, why they're different? It's because they're called unknown tongues. And they are. And they needed an interpreter. Whereas they say the tongues in Acts 2 did not need an interpreter, and they're not called, quote, unknown tongues. They make a big deal out of that. Well, that's a bogus objection. And the answer to that objection is simple. The tongues spoken by the 12 apostles in Acts 2 were not unknown because it was spoken in the language of everyone present. Acts 2:6 says that every man heard them speak in his own language. The 12 apostles spoke in the language of everyone present that day. Therefore, the tongues were not unknown. And because every man heard them speak and preach in his own language, there was no need for an interpreter. But the tongues spoke about the men in the church of Corinth were unknown to some people because they did not speak in the language of everyone present. Only 3 men could speak in tongues in the church of Corinth. We'll see that in just a moment. Just 3. Whereas 12 men spoke in tongues in Acts 2. And because only 3 men could speak in the church, there was always the possibility of someone being present that did not hear his language spoken, and to them everything that was spoken would be an unknown tongue. And due to that fact, there was always a need of an interpreter in Corinth. I'll illustrate it like this. I've used this illustration before, but it gets the point across. If there was a Russian, a Chinese, and a Japanese in the church, and you got up and quoted Ephesians 2:8-9 in Russian, and someone else quoted Ephesians 2:8-9 in Chinese, and then someone else quoted it in Japanese, Would there be a need of interpreter? No. Every man heard Ephesians 2:8-9 in his own language. And if we quote Ephesians 2:8-9 in the tongue of all three men, the Russian, the Chinese, the Japanese, have we spoken in an unknown tongue? No, because everything we said was understood by everybody because we spoke in the language of every man present. Well, that's the way it was in Acts 2 in Jerusalem. But suppose there was a Russian, Chinese, Japanese present. Somebody quoted Ephesians 2:8-9 in Russian. Someone else quoted Ephesians 2:8-9 in Chinese. But nobody quoted it in Japanese. Have we spoken in an unknown tongue then? Yes, we have. To who? The Japanese. Will there be a need of interpreter? Yes. For who? The Japanese. That's the way it was with the church at Corinth. In Jerusalem in Acts 2, there was no need for an interpreter because the 12 spoke in the language of everyone present. That's what it says. In Corinth, there was a need for an interpreter because the 2 or 3 men that did speak did not speak in the language of everyone present. In Jerusalem, in Acts 2, the tongues spoken were not unknown because everyone heard them speak in his own language. But in Corinth, the tongues that were spoken were unknown to some people because the 2 or 3 men that spoke did not speak in the language of everyone present. You know, the city of Corinth was a cosmopolitan city with men and women of many, many nationalities and languages, many languages. And no doubt it was quite probable that the church at Corinth had in the congregation individuals who spoke many languages other than just Greek or Hebrew. They spoke in many different languages because there were so many languages present in that big city. But in any case, whether known or unknown, whether an interpreter was needed or not, tongues are languages, and languages are tongues, and every tongue can be interpreted. And if that which is spoken today, you hear it today, if it cannot be interpreted, it's not a tongue. It's not a tongue. Now go back to 1 Corinthians 14 and notice the acquisition of tongues, how men acquired the gift. 1 Corinthians 14:1. Now he said here, follow after charity and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that you may prophesy. Now he said desire spiritual gifts. Notice they're called gifts. So how did the men acquire the ability to speak in tongues of foreign languages? I mean, did they spend 4 years in language school learning the language of the people they were being sent to? The answer is no. Tongues was a spiritual gift. And all spiritual gifts were given by God to man freely and miraculously. That's why it's called a gift. Those who had the gift of the Spirit, they didn't work themselves up into an emotional frenzy to receive the gifts. They didn't bring in a choir or a band or a song leader to whip up the crowd in a state of ecstasy to receive the gifts. And they didn't pray and agonize at an altar for hours and days and weeks and months to receive the gifts. They did not deny themselves food and water or fast to receive the gifts. They didn't cry and beg God for the gifts. If they had to do those things to receive the gifts of the Spirit, they would not be gifts and they wouldn't be spiritual. So the gifts were given to men freely by the grace of God without works. And those who spoke in tongues did so without help, aid, or previous education of any kind. On that day when Peter and them got up, they began to speak in languages they had never spoken before, and they didn't spend 1 second in language school. And isn't it hypocritical that before these Pentecostal and charismatic missionaries are sent to a foreign field, they're first sent to language school to learn the language of the people they're going to preach to. They have to learn the language. And isn't it hypocritical that when these Pentecostal charismatic preachers preach in a foreign country, they all speak through a translator because they're not able to speak in all the tongues of the people? I've seen, for example, Jimmy Swagger and a few others in Mexico and other countries, Africa and other places, stand up and preach, and right beside them, there's an interpreter. Yet these same men claim they have the gift of tongues. If they had the gift of tongues, why is it they have to speak through a translator? You see, the apostles, who had that real, genuine gift of tongues, did not spend 1 second in language school, or number 2, require a translator. Didn't need it. Didn't need either. They had the real, genuine article. They had the real gift of tongues. Now, let's talk about the imperfection of tongues. The imperfection. Now, the gift of tongues had disadvantages and imperfections that the other spiritual gifts did not have. Other gifts, for example, were greater than tongues. You know, of all the gifts of the Spirit listed in 1 Corinthians 14, tongues was ranked dead last. Look at 1 Corinthians 12. Well, 12:28. And God has set some of the church, first apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, government, diversities of tongues. Now you see where tongues is at? It's dead last. It's last on the list. That's not all. Tongues do not edify the church like the other gifts did. Look at verse 4, 1 Corinthians 14. 1 Corinthians 14:4. He that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifieth himself, but he that prophesieth edifieth the church. See that? The will of God is for the church to be edified. The Bible says so in Ephesians 4. Well, without an interpreter, tongues could not edify the church, which means those who spoke without an interpreter could not do the work of the ministry. They could not edify the body. Prophecy edified, but not tongues. The man edified himself, but didn't edify the church. And not only that, but tongues did not exhort and comfort the saints as the other gifts. Look at verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 14. But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. The man that prophesied, he was the man that spoke unto men to edification, exhortation, and comfort, not the man that spoke in tongues. Without an interpreter, no one could be interpreted, edified, or exhorted. And what good is a gift if it doesn't do those things? And not only that, you notice that without an interpreter, speaking in tongues, like I just said, did not edify the church, verse 5. And not only that, but speaking in tongues was indistinguishable from noise. Look at verse 7. And even things without life giving sound, whether a pipe or harp, except they give a distinction to sounds, how shall it be known what is piped or harp? Also, speaking in tongues did not prepare the saints for the battle. In verse 8 he said, for if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle? And he's talking about tongues. Tongues don't prepare people for the battle against the world, flesh, and the devil. And speaking in tongues, in a lot of cases, was wasted time and wasted words. In verse 9 he said, so likewise ye, except you utter by the tongue words easy to be understand, how shall it be known what is spoken, for you shall speak into the air? Wasted time, wasted words. That's not all. Speaking in tongues sounded barbaric to a lot of people. Look at verse 11. Therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me. And not only that, but speaking in tongues, some cases actually hindered lost people from being saved. In verse 23, he said, if therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that you are mad? But if all prophesy, there come in one that believeth not, or one unlearned, he is convinced of all, he is judged of all, and thus are the secrets of his heart made manifest, and so falling down his face, he will worship God and report that God is in you of a truth. See that? The man that spoke in tongues, lost man hears that, he thinks that guy's a barbarian, but the man that prophesied, now that caused the man to believe God, get saved. And not only that, but speaking in tongues caused confusion in the church. Down in verse 33, Paul wrote, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. You know, look at verse 19 in this chapter. Verse 19. Yet in the church I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that by my voice I might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. Paul said right there that a man that spoke just 5 words the church could understand was better than a man who spoke 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. That breaks down to a ratio of about 2,000 to 1. Ratio of about 2,000 to 1. In other words, if a man spoke just 1 word the church could understand, he was better than a man who spoke 2,000 words in an unknown tongue. So the disadvantages of the gift of tongues far outweigh the advantages. The gift of tongues was an imperfect gift, even with an interpreter, and a useless gift without one. And the majority of statements that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 14 about tongues are negative. Just go and read through the chapter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's about 16 negative comments that Paul makes about the gift of tongues in this chapter. Very imperfect gift, with an interpreter, and a useless one without it. Now, the restriction of tongues, the restrictions. Now, at the time that God gave the gift of tongues, he also placed a number of controls or restrictions on the use of the gift. Those who had the gift of tongues were required to follow a strict set of guidelines when they spoke in tongues. No other gift had as many restrictions as the gift of tongues. And the restrictions were necessary due to its widespread misuse and because the devil counterfeited that particular gift. Now, what were the restrictions? Well, look at verse 27. Here they are. If any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, at the most by 3, and that by course, or let one interpret. But if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. And then verse 34, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. Now, first of all, you notice that there was a restricted number of people who could speak in tongues, a restricted number. In verse 27, he said, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, or at the most by 3. So when God gave the gift of tongues, the most who could speak in tongues in any assembly was 3. And if God said at the most by 3, you know God did not lead 4 or 5 or 10 people to speak in tongues in any assembly. If God led more than 3 to speak in tongues in that assembly, he would have contradicted his own word. He said at the most by 3. Secondly, there was a restriction as to when they could speak in tongues. When? In verse 27, God said, "If any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by two, or at the most three, and that by course." That by course. So when people spoke in tongues, they spoke by course. That is, they spoke in an orderly manner, one following the other. In the assembly, the three men who were led to speak in tongues did not all speak at the same time. They did not all speak at the same time. The first man got up, spoke in tongues, sat down. The second man got up, spoke in tongues, sat down. The third man got up and spoke in tongues and sat down. And they were all that were allowed to speak in tongues in that assembly. And never at any time did God ever lead those three men to speak in tongues at the same time. Never did it. They spoke in an orderly manner, not at the same time. Also, there was a restriction upon who could speak in tongues. Who? There were two people who were expressly forbidden to speak in tongues in the assembly. Number one, a man could not speak in tongues if he did not have an interpreter. In verse 28 it says, "But if there be no interpreter, let him," the man, "keep silence in the church." Under no circumstances was a man allowed to speak in tongues without someone to interpret what he was saying. If he did not have an interpreter, he was commanded to keep silent. And then secondly, under no circumstances was a woman ever allowed to speak in tongues. In verse 34 he said, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the Lord." Now when God said for the woman not to speak or to keep silence in the churches, there's no doubt whatsoever he's referring to speaking in tongues. Tongues is a subject of chapter 12, 13, and 14. In chapter 14 alone, the word tongues appears 15 times. 15 times. Therefore, when he said for a woman not to speak and to keep silent, that was a command for a woman not to speak in tongues, period. So under no circumstances was a woman ever allowed to speak in tongues in the assembly. And God never gave a woman the gift to speak in tongues. He never did it. But yet, you know what? I've seen assemblies, churches, where women spoke in, quote, so-called tongues. As a matter of fact, what I've witnessed is that in assemblies where I've seen it practiced, I've never seen one interpreter. And the majority of those who spoke were women. And to quote a former Pentecostal preacher, he said the Pentecostal movement is largely a woman's movement. And the majority who speak in, quote, tongues in these assemblies are women. So you see, God foreknew that without controls and restrictions, the gift of tongues would be misused, counterfeited, and would lead to confusion and chaos in the church. And that's why God, in his infinite wisdom, placed these controls on the exercise of the gift. God is a God of order and organization, not chaos and confusion. And the only way the church in Acts could be edified was for those restrictions to be strictly enforced. Now the Corinthians, they broke the rules that God set down in 1 Corinthians 14, and they also counterfeited the true gift of tongues with satanic ones. And the charismatics, the Pentecostals of today, they do not observe or enforce any of these restrictions. As a matter of fact, they violate every one of them. They violate every one of them. For example, they all, every assembly I've ever seen in, they all spoke in tongues. There's more than three. I've seen where you got 10, 20, and 30, and 50 people speaking in, quote, tongues, and they all speak at the same time, and the men who speak don't have interpreters, and women are allowed to speak. So they break every one, they violate every one of these rules. Now, how can something be of God if it violates the Word of God and breaks His commandments like that? I mean, God don't lead people to disobey His Word and contradict what He said. And if God said the most that can speak is 3, He is not going to lead 4, 5, 10, and 20, and 50, as you see today. And if God says the 3 men that can speak have to speak one following the other, God is not leading all these people to speak in quote tongues today at the same time. God is not in that. And if God said for the man not to speak with interpreter, then all these men today quote speaking in tongues without interpreters. You know God not leading them. And God said for the woman not to speak period in tongues. And the majority of people that do it today are women. It's totally and completely out of the will of God. God is nowhere near the Pentecostal charismatic movement of churches. And that's why I wouldn't set foot in one of them. I'd be scared to set foot in some of these churches. The stuff that goes on, the spirits that are present in these churches today. But anyway, that's the gift of tongues. There was a time and a very good reason why God gave men the gift of tongues. Now, we'll learn later on that God has withdrawn the gift. He makes that very clear in chapter 13. Tongues, that gift was withdrawn, and for good reason. And we'll look at that next time. Okay.